Welcome to Module 3 in EDU510. This module is going to be a busy one because the assignments that you're going to be required to do, each of them important in the learning process. The first, of course, is the reflection forum. The difference between a normal forum and this reflection forum is that responses are welcome, but they're not required. So you're certainly free to talk back and forth about your responses to one another, but I will be marking your reflection forum on February the 12th, which is generally when your reflection is due and not your responses. In other words, the reflection is due by February the 12th, which is a week earlier than normal for the whole process of the reflection forum. And the reason for that is because your other assignment is one that does take some significant amount of time, and it's an important one because it's something that you'll be able to build on for your research project. The annotated bibliography and synthesis is the name of the entire assignment. However, you'll be doing the first part of the assignment, which does not include a synthesis. So you'll only be doing the annotated bibliography for set 1, which is comprised of 5 articles. Only one of those articles may be from a professional journal, which of course you'll know by now exactly what that means, professional and academic journals and the differences between them, having done the genre assignment in Module 2. You're going to create an annotated bibliography for the 5 articles that you've chosen, and that will be formatted in the following form. So first of all, you'll include a reference for each article using APA 6th edition. So you'll begin with that reference, and that will be the top at the top of your first, second, third, fourth, and fifth entries. And then under each of those references, you will include a brief, and I underline the word brief, summary of the research goals, methodology, and analysis strategies used by the author, as that's applicable. Now, each reading has its own emphasis and things that may not be included in that assignment, in that paper. And so you may find that certain parts of that summary are not actually included in your article, and that's fine. But you will include as much of that as you possibly can, very, very briefly, because an annotated bibliography is meant to be a brief snapshot of an article so that you can go back later on and have a listing of those annotated bibliographies and be able to make a judgment about whether that's worth having a really close look at again for the research project that you're doing. So in 3 or 4 sentences, you're going to talk about basically what the article is about and the major things that the author uses in justifying the claims that they make and that sort of thing. And then you're going to briefly discuss the significant conclusions made by the author and the relevance of those conclusions to your own topic of interest. So you can do that in 1 or 2 sentences. For this assignment, your précis skills are going to be very, very important. So you're going to need to pick and choose those things that are the essence of the article and things that are interesting but aren't important to a brief summary of the article. You will need to set aside. It's to be a maximum of 5 pages, not including the title page. Please include a title page. All assignments need to have a title page. I'm still getting them in without it, so make sure that you do. It's a part of the protocol of an assignment. And an important way of identifying things a year on when you're wondering where you put something and you need that information from that assignment for something that you're doing in your research project or whatever. So make sure that you identify things clearly. Your assignment is going to be double-spaced. You're going to use a font like Times New Roman. It could be Calibri, but nothing flowery, with doodads and fancy script and that sort of thing, but just straightforward font that's easy to read in a 12-point font, and you will use 1-inch margins. Now, if it's a little longer than that, I'm not going to have a heart attack, but if it's substantially longer than that, like by another page, then you need to go back and you need to do some more cutting and be merciless. So so make sure that you pay attention to that, because the essence of an annotated bibliography is clarity and brevity and succinctness in terms of the content. Okay, so you're also going to be doing a reading, and you're going to be watching 2 other videos, the Robertson videos, which are about paradigms. The Guba and Lincoln article is one that is a stretch. It's a heavily philosophical article. It's going to bring up terms that you may or may not be familiar with. And I'm hoping that this video will clarify some of those, some of that terminology, so that when you get to the article, you'll feel more comfortable with it. If you go away from the article not having a really clear understanding of its meaning, you might want to go back and have a look through it again, but don't worry about that, because some of these things will come up again through other articles and through other courses that you're going to be looking at. So you'll be able to eventually go back to Guba and Lincoln and think, oh, this is a piece of cake. First time through, it's a tough slog. So I warn you of that up front. However, it's an important article, and I'll go into the reasons for that when I talk about it more specifically. You'll find the links to these articles, because they are not in your text. You'll find them by going to the links on Course Spaces. You'll go to Getting Started. You'll see, kind of like little file tabs almost at the top, and you will go to the one that says Required Readings. And when you go to that link, you will find the articles. So now that I've talked about Lincoln and Guba in this way, who are they? First of all, they're a married couple, although Egan Guba died several years ago. Ivana Lincoln continues to work and continues to write, and it continues to do a great deal of work with Norman Denzin. So you'll sometimes see in some of the research articles written by Lincoln and Denzin, or Denzin and Lincoln. So she has continued to work in the area of research methodologies, and particularly post-positivist methodologies in education research. And so these are 2 prolific and highly respected authors in the area of educational research. You will see their names cited often. And so I know it's not perhaps an easy entry into some of these ideas, but they were among the first to bring these ideas from other areas of research, other academic disciplinary areas of research, into education, and find connections to the kinds of questions that educators were seeking a way to wrestle with and didn't have the tools. And Lincoln and Guba have provided that. So I would strongly urge you to set aside the time to really spend some time with these readings and really kind of get them deep-seated in your understanding, so that you could bring that understanding to your own work in your educational research. In the article, we're going to be looking at particular kinds of terminology, and I'm in particular concerned with 3 kinds of terminology that you may have encountered in other courses, but I just wanted to be sure that we were on the same page around these particular concepts. The first is ontology. And ontology, I should preface this by saying that all 3, if you looked for articles and books, could fill a whole library. So I'm not doing them a huge service by looking at them so briefly, but hopefully this will be helpful. Ontology is really around the nature of being, what things are, what is the essence of the thing itself. And when you're considering that, for example, when you're looking at what is the essence of a table? What is the nature of being a table? What is the nature of being a chair, a book, etc.? What is the essence of the thing itself? That is, you're looking at the ontology of what is. And so it's, in a way, it's identifying or enabling you then to differentiate a table from a chair, for example. When you get into concepts that are more esoteric, like love or
equity or teaching, etc., it becomes much more complex. So when we're looking at this, sorry about that. I have this pop-up that keeps coming up. It drives me crazy. Anyway, when you're looking at these concepts, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ontology. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. Some of you in your observations, for example, you might have noticed me making a little comment about, can you really make this conclusion based on the evidence that you provided? And you might have thought that I was being extra picky, and I don't know, maybe I was, but I just wanted you to start thinking about how we oftentimes do not differentiate between justified belief and opinion. And of course, epistemology is the study of what justifies that belief. How is it that we can know what we think we know? How can we distinguish these kinds of justifications for the kinds of conclusions that we come to in the research that we do? Methodology, and these follow on one another in very important ways. Methodology, then, is the systematic theoretical analysis of the methods applied to a field of study. It comprises the theoretical analysis of the body of methods and principles associated with a branch of knowledge. So we're not talking about methods. We're not talking about what we actually do. That is, we use a survey or we use interviews, etc. But how is it that we can theoretically analyze the methods that we use, and how is it that they attach to our epistemology and ontology? So these three areas are of primary consideration when we're thinking about research and the kind of research that we do. The last term that we're using is actually perhaps should have been the first, in that it's the overarching concept over ontology, epistemology, and methodology. And Guba and Lincoln talk about that in their article. It's a distinct, what is a paradigm then? It's a distinct set of concepts or thought patterns. And that distinct set of thought patterns and concepts constitutes a basic belief system or worldview. We all operate, whether we can articulate it or not, we all operate within a basic belief system or worldview. And that basic belief system or worldview guides us in the decisions that we make as an investigator, in the choices of method that we use, and more importantly, perhaps, since they overarch the methods, the ontology and epistemology that informs how we interrogate the world in fundamental ways. Paradigm encompasses theories, research methods, postulates, and standards for what constitutes legitimate contributions to a field. So in the field of educational administration, in the field of curriculum studies and so on, there are particular ways in which, for example, when I submit an article, my fellow academics make a decision about whether that article meets the standards of that field in terms of the research that I've done. And they may send it back to me and say, you haven't considered this, you haven't considered that, and I need to do that before I can resubmit that article. Thomas Kuhn talks about this. He's talking particularly about the field of the, one might call the hard sciences, but he's looking in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, which I think is telling because, of course, the 60s and the 70s were a time of great questioning of what existed and a lot of social revolution. So it's not surprising, really, that someone would be considering how it is that these paradigmatic shifts that were happening all around us in that period of time, how that was happening. And he introduced the notion of paradigm shift. And you'll often hear this phrase used, often incorrectly, because they're really not talking about paradigms at all. But nevertheless, it has been taken up in common usage. But what he's talking about is the kind of paradigm that we've discussed and that Lincoln and Guba discuss as well. And he argues that paradigm shifts don't happen in a linear or continuous way. It isn't, one day we're doing quantitative research and the next day we're doing qualitative, or it's kind of a smooth transition from one to the other. It's often raucous, it's often dramatic, it's often melodramatic. It's not smooth and continuous. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Because as you open up new ways of thinking about phenomena, then that validity of those new ways then is questioned. And so, I submit an article using qualitative methodology and the dominant paradigm is quantitative. How is it that my work will be judged by my peers? How will it be seen as valid? Will it be accepted or rejected? And over time, as this conversation continues in lively and very spirited ways sometimes, slowly things will be accepted. And some will continue to reject. But over time, a consensus begins to build that this particular kind of research is okay. So, for example, hermeneutic phenomenological research or interpretivist research in educational administration began to be accepted. I wouldn't have had nearly the problems that I had when I did my work several years ago within the academic community. So these competing paradigms then can be seen as incommensurable. And so this creates tension. And in many ways they are, as Lincoln and Guba suggest in their article, there's real difficulty bridging that gap between positivism, post-positivism, and critical and interpretivist. That chasm is very, very wide. But there are those who argue, and argue quite eloquently, that you can use them to inform one another, but as paradigms, they are incommensurable. So I'll give you an example of Tom Greenfield. Tom Greenfield is a scholar who actually did his PhD at the U of A. At the time, he became an expert in doing quantitative research. He was well known in the field of quantitative research, used often as a consultant. He became well known in his field. His writing was in this area. When he went to the U of T, he continued with this work, and then he had a sabbatical. He went to Europe. He studied European philosophy. Apparently that was an interest of his that he had developed. And he came across what broadly is called interpretivism. The Romantic philosophers they're sometimes referred to. And when he thought about what he was learning in relation to his field of study, he began to see that one could think very differently. One could move into a different paradigm. One could shift paradigms in thinking about the field of educational administration. And so he began to think about and write about this field in this particular way. He gave his first paper I believe it was 1979. I could be wrong about that. But he gave it in Bristol in England at a large conference that was attended as well by Daniel Griffiths, a well-known quantitative researcher in educational administration in the United States, highly influential. He attended Tom Greenfield's presentation, and it must have been compelling because it really called into question much of what Griffiths had been doing. And there was, to quote those who attended, a bit of a shouting match that occurred. It was a very, very lively discussion that occurred between these two scholars who came from different paradigmatic positions, both of them rather powerful. And so, although Griffiths was much more powerful, had a much wider audience in the United States, of course. So from that point on, you'll find it difficult, for example, to find books by Tom Greenfield because he couldn't get published. His articles were published in some journals. There were some collections of his papers that were published especially in Australia and the UK, interestingly enough. Never in the US. There were very, very few scholars who took up his work, few. Most of them who were critical scholars who were starting to emerge in the US. And so this paradigm shift occurred actually right about the time it was starting to really take root at the time that I started my master's, and so you can begin to understand why the tensions were still there. So it's just an illustration of how deeply felt, how deeply seated these paradigmatic shifts are. All right, just to move along very quickly then, let's look quickly then at the kind of construct or skeleton of the Guba and Lincoln article. They, of course, consider this paradigmatic shift from quantitative to qualitative. And they look at, and they argue that the quantitative paradigm was largely dominant and continues to be in many ways, whether in the physical or the human sciences or the social sciences, we might call them. And that continues to be the case. So, for example, a highly influential field of study in education would be psychology. And psychology still, to this day, is highly dominated by quantitative research. That's not to say that qualitative doesn't occur. Pardon me, I have a dry throat. It doesn't occur, but the dominant paradigm is quantitative. When the social sciences, the human sciences began to emerge in universities, in education, in sociology, etc., the quantitative paradigm was taken up because it was the dominant one in universities. And it, to some degree, provided some stature and acceptance within this academic community for these new fields of inquiry. But it did take a while, actually, for critiques to start to emerge, because one could argue that it's very different to establish the point at which water boils as compared to the point at which good teaching occurs. And so these are kind of incommensurable domains in some ways. That's not to say that they don't overlap to some degree, but those overlaps are few and far between. So internal critiques started to emerge. And those internal critiques were around the fact that research did not take into consideration context, and context is crucial in education. It excluded meaning and the meaning and purpose of education. And when we think, for example, of the Hostetler article talking about educational research should have meaning, it should make a difference. This disjunction of grand theories from local contexts, because the work needed to be generalizable to all contexts, quantitative work that is. Qualitative work, on the other hand, offers the opportunity to look at the particular rather than the general. The inability or inapplicability of the general to the specific, and the exclusion of discovery. That with quantitative work, you start from what you know or what you think you know, and then you go on to prove it. Whereas in qualitative work, sometimes you don't know exactly what it is that you're going to find. You have no idea, really. So you introduce a general area or a general question. You kind of set a direction, but then something may emerge that you didn't expect at all that changes the research entirely. And so the critique was that quantitative work didn't offer that opportunity. The external critiques, Guba and Lincoln argue, were even more important. These are the more heavily philosophical critiques around the theory-ladenness of facts, the underdetermination of theory, that theory underdetermines context, for example, the value-ladenness of facts, that facts, when we take them up, as you found out when you were doing your observations, are attached to values. They're attached to our beliefs. They're attached to belief systems and worldviews. And people with different worldviews may look at the same set of facts and ask different questions of them or see different things within them. They also, one of the external critiques was the interactive nature of the inquirer and the inquired, and how they need to be thought of as intertextual rather than separate from one another. So both sets of critiques were influential, but the second set proved to be the tipping point for paradigmatic change. So the nature of paradigms and what do we know about them? And they conclude with this, and I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides. First of all, we have the ontological, epistemological, and methodological questions that attach to each of these positions. But they stress some caveats around the whole notion of paradigms. That is, that you can't prove within a shadow of a doubt that quantitative research is better than qualitative research. They come from different domains. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. So none are open to proof in any kind of conventional sense. Each represents the most informed and sophisticated view of its proponents. So over time, this is what we know about a particular kind of quantitative research. This is what we know about a particular kind of qualitative research. This is the most informed and sophisticated view of those who do that kind of work. And that becomes, in some senses, the standard by which it's judged. But all of these views are human constructions. They have been developed by academics and scholars over a period of time through trial and error, through review, etc. And all must rely on persuasiveness and utility rather than proof in arguing its position. So if you're arguing that you are going to be using quantitative research for a particular research study, then you need to be persuasive about why it is that you've chosen that method and what it's going to offer you that other methods cannot. And that's how you justify the kind of research methodology and methods that you use. So then they go on to take on positivism, post-positivism, critical theory et al. And I would argue, and I think others would argue, that postmodernism and post-structuralism are a different kettle of fish in some ways. But I think they are in many ways commensurable to critical theory, so I won't argue about that. Just to add that as a little note, that since they wrote this article, I am guessing that there might be some movement around that. And then the fourth category is constructivism, naturalism, which comes out of interpretivist tradition. So you'll sometimes hear it called constructivism, sometimes naturalism, sometimes interpretivism. They all have a slightly different meaning, but they're very, very close in their characteristics to one another. And in the rest of the paper, then, we talk about basic beliefs of received and alternative paradigms, an interparadigmatic kind of analysis between these four paradigms, a cross-paradigm analysis, which is very interesting, and then finally, and I think in some ways most interestingly, the implications of each paradigm's position on selected practical issues. So they talk about what is the nature of knowledge. And of course, this has implications, right? Because the nature of knowledge for me comes out of my worldview. It comes out of my life experience. If someone has a different worldview, for example, there's been a lot of very interesting research around indigeneity and indigenous worldviews. And that has implications then for how it is that you construct your research. So how is a body of knowledge constructed then based on that body, the nature of that knowledge? And that has then implications for the kind of work that we can have a look at. When quantitative research was the dominant paradigm, that's what I had to read, even though it wasn't speaking to me and what I wanted to look at. Nevertheless, that was all I had to look at. So if we don't, if there isn't a paradigm that responds to the kinds of questions that we want to ask, that come out of our worldview and our experience of the world, then that has real implications then for scholars who come from different kinds of experiences and worldviews. What's the role of values? What's the place of ethics? What is the place of voice? And of course, that question has real implications for example, feminist research. It has significant implications for indigenous research and so on. And then what about novice inquirers? And the tension that there might be between paradigms. Are paradigms in conflict? Well, I think this article suggests that they are, but there are others who say that there's a way for them to come together. Creswell would be one of them. And which is most influential? And of course, most would argue now, given this age of accountability, that quantitative research has gained some ascendancy after a period of time in which qualitative research really took on a space and place in educational research. So I'm sorry to have gone on to some length here, but I hope that these comments have been helpful to you and that you'll be able to use this in some kind of useful and meaningful way when you're reading Guba and Lincoln. And if you have any questions about any of this or the assignments, please feel free to get in touch with me. I welcome your inquiries.